Hello, and a very warm welcome to the online launch of State of the Nordic Region, a brand new report from Nordregio, a Nordic research institute founded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. My name is Miia Itänen. I am a communication advisor here at Nordregio, and I will be your host throughout today's session and this online launch. In the next hour or so, hour and a half, we're going to go through the report and some latest updates of trends and developments across the Nordic regions, cities, and countries. You will hear from some of my colleagues, from the authors of the report. They will give you some of the highlights, some of the novelties, and some persistent trends that are influencing the Nordic region as a whole and drilling into the regional level as well. But before we get into that, we have been absolutely thrilled by the interest shown towards the report, and there's a lot of participants joining us for this online launch. I would like to get a little bit more information about who's actually following us live today and who's going to be in this session. We hope to make it an interactive one. You'll have a chance to ask questions and share your comments and all that. But to get to it, let's get to know each other a little bit before we dive into the topic of the day. To do that, we have a little welcome poll that we're going to launch right now. I would just like to get a little bit of an input from you in terms of the country you come from, the sector you work in, and your expectations for today's session. While you reply to the poll, I am going to take you through what we have on the agenda for you today, because the agenda is very full. The report is very dense, it's heavy, full of content and details, and we will only be able to share some of the highlights with you today, but we have tried to pack as much information into this session as possible. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. There are a few simple points. The agenda is very straightforward. We're going to start with the little introduction. You're going to do that with me right here, and then we are going to go through the different sections of the report one by one. We're going to hear a little presentation from our research team and the authors of the report, and you'll have a chance to ask questions after each of the presentations. We're going to start with demography. That will be a presentation by Nora, Sánchez, Gassen. Then we will move over to the labor market with Gustaf, Norlén, and follow up with an overview of economic developments across the Nordic region with Refsgaard. Finally, we will also have a look at the newly updated Regional Potential Index with Tapia, and then we will wrap it up with a short conclusion. And as said, we hope to have a very active and interactive session full of your comments and feedback as well. We will share the highlights that we have taken away from the report, but we would love to hear about your thoughts and reflections in that regard as well. So please make use of the chat. If you have already replied to the poll, and I see that quite a few of you have, almost 80% already replied, drop a quick message in the chat as well and let us know where exactly you're joining from. We asked for the countries in the poll, but I would also like to know the region or the city you're connecting from today, just to see how much of the Nordic region we've got covered and if we have any participants joining from even beyond. That'll be your test for using the chat, and you can keep using it throughout the session. I will be keeping an eye on it and picking up some of your questions as we go along. I can see from the results that we have a lot of participants from Sweden, Norway, Finland, also Denmark, even Iceland is covered. We have Faroe Islands, no participants yet from Greenland, Åland is covered, and plenty from other countries as well. So especially if your country was not on the list, please do drop that in the chat and let us know where you are connecting from. In terms of the sectors that are represented, I see a very even split. We have people working at the state level, at the regional level, as well as people from municipalities, academics, as well as business and NGO representatives. So a very nice and even split. I hope we have some interesting updates to share with each of you. Before we go further with our speakers, we have a very special guest to deliver a little opening message. Before starting the tour of the Nordic region as a whole, we're going to take a direct connection to Copenhagen and connect with Karen Ellemann, the Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers, who will introduce the state of the Nordic region. We'll be back after this.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be part of this launch of the 2024 edition of the State of the Nordic Region. What makes this report unique is that it dives deep into demographics, into jobs and the economy across all the Nordic countries. It provides us with an in-depth analysis of the current state of the Nordic region. Why does this matter? Well, we are facing challenges like the lasting effects of the pandemic, climate change, and a strained global geopolitical landscape. This report is full of data, full of maps and insights to help us navigate these challenges. It's a chance to see how far we've come and also what needs work and how we can shape a better future for the entire Nordic region. So get out there, read the report, dive into the data, and let us use this information to build a stronger Nordic region together. Thank you for joining us today.
As you heard, a report full of inspiration, at least we hope so, and we are very keen for you to make use of it and also let us know what you take away from it. I can see that you already got off to a good start with the chat, which is great. Please do keep it going throughout the session. I love to see people connecting from so many different parts of the Nordic region and even beyond. So hello again to all of you. If you missed the opening poll, you can still post in the chat and let us know where you're connecting from, and we're very happy to have you as a part of this session. Please stay this active throughout the whole hour and a half that we're going to be spending together. Let's have a little bit of context before we go to the specific sections of the report. As you heard, we have been working very closely with the Nordic Council of Ministers for the preparation of this report, and we have also worked very closely with policymakers at the state level as well as at the regional level. We already shared some of the highlights yesterday in a meeting of regional ministers from the Nordic countries that was held in Karlstad. So we are already sharing these updates across the Nordic region as we go along. Today is a part of sharing some of those highlights, and we hope that you join us in this effort to take the message further. So pick your highlights, take the message further, discuss it in your regions, in your cities, in your organizations, in your countries, and let's see how we can work together to make the Nordic region the most integrated and sustainable region in the world. For those of you who might not be so familiar with the state of the Nordic region as a report, the edition that we are launching today and this year, the 2024 edition, is already the 20th in line. So it builds on a long history and long record of reports. The report is published every 2 years, and it takes stock of the key socio-economic trends across the Nordic region. The previous one was published just after the pandemic in 2022, so now is a time to take a look at what has happened since and where we are headed towards next. The sections of the report cover 3 main aspects, and as said, that's what we are going to be discussing in this session. We will start with a look at demography and demographic trends and developments. Then we will look at labor market, how it has developed since the pandemic, how we are doing in terms of skills, looking at how green transition is influencing the labor market. And then we will look at economy from different perspectives and see what the status and the state of the Nordic economy really is at the moment. And we will also introduce our regional potential index that pulls it all together. So we will look at some of the challenges, some opportunities, as well as some achievements from the Nordic regions and countries over the past years. The report itself is structured into 10 chapters and will give you highlights from different parts, but the full report is available, and you can go and browse it after this webinar and take a look at the details. You can find all the maps that we will be sharing, the charts, the updates and statistics in the report available as a digital version as well as in print and PDF. There is a lot of information. This might be the most extensive State of the Nordic Region report that we've done so far, so there's plenty of content to go through, and we really hope that you make good use of it and find the statistics and details that are of value for you and for your work. Without further ado, we will come back to you in terms of where to find the report, how to work with it. We'll share some useful links in the chat, but now it is time to start going into the content. And to do that, we will start, as said, by looking into demography and how the demography has developed in the Nordic region over the past years. That presentation will be done by Nora Sánchez Gassen, one of our senior research fellows here at Nordregio, and she will tell you more. So, Nora, I will hand over to you to present the demographic developments.
Thank you very much, Miia, for the introduction. We just wait for the slides to be pulled up so we can all go ahead. Yes, and here we are. I hope you can see them as well. Hello, everyone, also from me. My name is Nora Sánchez Gassen. I work here as a senior research fellow at Nordregio, and it is my pleasure to share with you some of the findings from the demography section of the State of the Nordic Region. Here at Nordregio, we are a whole team of researchers who've worked together on this demography section in the State of the Nordic Region. And we thought it was a very interesting task to explore what has happened during the last 2 years. Because, of course, we all know that the pandemic had huge demographic impacts in the Nordic region, but also elsewhere. We know it affected our health, mortality, fertility trends, migration, etc. Those different trends we've tried to describe in the last State of the Nordic Region, and I've put the cover of the latest edition here for you from 2022. So there we really try to describe the impacts of the pandemic. But then there has perhaps been a little less public interest in what has happened since then. What has happened since we declared an end to the pandemic in 2022? This was the leading question that we had for the demography section, and we were very interested to explore this and see what has happened. So in this year's State of the Nordic Region, we start by giving a broad overview of population change in the Nordic region. How have our population numbers developed? But we also dig a bit deeper into different demographic topics. We look at internal migration, for example. We also look at fertility, diversity, and some other topics. The report is very rich, as Miia already said, lots of maps and figures for you to explore. You can see how your country is doing, how your region is doing in comparison to others or your municipality. So I can really invite you to have a look there. There's a lot of very rich results to explore. But for today, I've picked 5 key messages for you from the demography section to give you an idea of what kind of material you can find there and what some of our key conclusions are. And we can start with the first one that you see here. Fertility is record low in many parts of the Nordic region at the moment. And this you can see when you look at the figure here on the right-hand side. What we've plotted here for you is the total fertility rate in our Nordic countries and regions. Total fertility rate, you may be familiar with that concept. It's a demographic indicator which more or less tells you how many children on average a woman would end up with if our current fertility behaviors would persist in the future. So it tells you in a way how many children would each woman have on average if we would continue to do as we do today. And we've plotted here for you the indicator over time and how it has developed from 2000 onwards. And if you look very closely, you can see that over the last 15 years or so, there has been a bit of a downward trend in fertility in many Nordic countries and regions. This was interrupted a little bit during the pandemic, where indeed we've seen an increase in fertility. So a short break in the trend. People thought it was a good time to have a baby during the pandemic, but that was a very short-lived phenomenon. And we see already later on, the last years after the pandemic, fertility dropped quite rapidly again in some countries and regions and has been declining even further or stayed at low levels since then. So at the moment, we can say that we have total fertility which ranges from 1.3 children in Finland to 2.1 children on the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands are a bit of an outlier here. In most of the other countries and regions, fertility is a lot lower. And as my colleague Timothy Heleniak writes in his chapter, this level of fertility is low or even record low if we look at it from over time. A second key message from the demography chapters is that mortality in the Nordic region remains high and life expectancy has declined after the end of the pandemic. This is remarkable, I would say. You may remember that, of course, in the pandemic we had high mortality levels and no surprises there. You may remember the concept of excess mortality that was used a lot in that context, excess mortality, to describe that we had higher mortality levels than usual during the pandemic, of course, because of COVID-19. But you may know that excess mortality even persisted after the pandemic. If we look at monthly mortality statistics from Eurostat, we can see that in almost every month in 2022, in almost every country in the Nordic region, we had excess mortality, and also that happened in other parts of Europe and the world. So mortality has remained rather high, and not only that, we can even see that life expectancy has declined. This also in itself is remarkable because we did also have life expectancy declines during the pandemic, but there it happened more in 1 year in one country, in 1 year in another country. It was a little bit more mixed. Now in 2022, we see quite consistent declines in life expectancy across Nordic countries and regions. And this you can see on the figure that I have plotted here. You see we compare here the Nordic countries and regions, and we have data for men and women. And what you can see is life expectancy that was registered in 2021, that's the blue bars. And then life expectancy in 2022, and that's the orange bars. It's a bit difficult to see, but if you look very carefully, you will see that it declined everywhere. And the only exception is men in Sweden, who had a little increase in their life expectancy, but everywhere else declines. That, of course, one can ask, why is that? How can that happen after the pandemic? The research on this is ongoing, the discussion is ongoing. There's probably not one factor that you can attribute this to, but rather a range of factors. You may think, for example, that COVID-19 is still around. Even though we've declared an end of the pandemic, COVID-19 is still here. So people could still get sick and also die from it. We also know that the prolonged periods of social isolation we had during the pandemic, we know this made us less immune to other types of infections that were around. And once we opened up our societies again after the pandemic, we were a bit more vulnerable to those kinds of infections as well. And then, of course, already during the pandemic, there were a lot of concerns that the strains on our healthcare systems and hospitals might mean that other types of diseases, other types of conditions might be diagnosed later and less effectively, and also treated later than would have been done in other times. So it may be that these declines that we're seeing now are, in a way, ripple effects or repercussions of the pandemic still. I just mentioned to you that we had declines in fertility after the pandemic, coupled with relatively high levels of mortality. Still, in combination, this means that we actually registered more deaths than births in 2022 in the Nordic regions, or in large areas of the Nordic region. And that you can see here on the map to the right-hand side. Here we look at natural population change. When we talk about natural population change, we compare births and deaths in the Nordic region, births and deaths. Areas that you see shaded in blue here, these are areas where we still registered more births than deaths, so a surplus of births. Areas that you see in red, these are areas where we had more deaths than births, so a surplus of deaths. Overall, if you look carefully, you will see that these areas in blue, these are urban areas, often located in the south of our countries. Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, they're a bit of an exception, but otherwise it's often the urban areas where more young people live that still had this surplus of births. In large parts of our country, however, we've seen a surplus of deaths. And again, you see the map looks quite red, so it may not come as a surprise to you if I tell you that 2022 was also the first year where, for the Nordic region as a whole, if we consider it as a whole, we had more deaths than births. We have a timeline reaching back to 1975. 2022 is the first year and the only year so far where we had more deaths than births. It looks like 2023 may be a similar situation. So also this, I think, a quite remarkable development that this happened after the pandemic, not during the pandemic. Another message from the demography chapters is that Nordic societies are becoming increasingly diverse. Of course, this is not a new story. This is a trend that has been going on for a long time, but we see that this trend has also persisted and continued in the last 2 years. This you can see on this figure. It shows you the share of our populations in the Nordic countries and regions, the share of our populations which is foreign born, so our immigrants, those who were born abroad but moved to a Nordic country during their lifetime and now live here. You can see that there's been this steady and rather robust increasing trend since 1990 in almost all countries and regions. And if you look at the very right-hand side of the figure, you can see that according to the latest figures, levels are highest in Sweden, Iceland, and Åland. Sweden, of course, has a longer-term history of migration. Iceland, there the increase has happened quite rapidly in the last 15 years, also related to the tourism boom and all the jobs that emerged there. On the other hand of the spectrum, further down, we have Finland, where currently around 9% of the population are foreign-born. This is lower than in the other Nordic countries, and Finland, of course, has a more recent migration history. But even there, we still see this very steady trend. The only exception that we can point out is here is Greenland, where we have seen a decline in the percentage of foreign-born people over time. As I understand, this is related to the fact that now fewer Danes live in Denmark than they used to in the past. But otherwise, we see this continuing trend of increasing trend, and there's also no real signs that this is leveling off. So we can prepare to become more diverse societies also going forward. Then, as my colleague Timothy Heleniak writes in his chapter, people don't tend to move to countries, they move to places. So it's also very relevant to look at where people actually move, where do they settle, where do they live when they are in the Nordic region. And this you can see on the map here to the right, where we looked at the percent, again, the percent of foreign-born people among the total population. But here we look at municipal and regional level, and the darker the blue, the higher the share of foreign-born people. Again, I think no surprises here. We see that it's often the urban areas with more varied employment opportunities, more varied educational opportunities that attract a lot of immigrants. But there are some exceptions. For example, you see in Iceland, many municipalities with high levels of immigrants connected to tourism, but as I understand also the fishing industry. Northern Norway along the coast also has some municipalities with high shares of foreign immigrants, foreign-born people, again, tied to the fishing industry. And we can, for example, also look at the border between Sweden and Finland. Also there, higher shares of foreign-born people. This is a link to the very close connection we have between these two countries there at the border. But overall, I think this map again reminds us that place is important, space is important. And when we talk about immigration and integration, it's very important to look at those spatial patterns, spatial variations in where people live. Because we do know that we have a challenge with spatial segregation in the Nordic countries. And we also know from research and experience that spatial segregation leads to poorer integration outcomes. So this is a task for us now, but especially also going forward, trying to analyze these trends of spatial segregation, trying to counteract them if possible, so we give immigrants a better chance to integrate into our Nordic societies in terms of language, in terms of social contacts, but also in terms of the labor market. And with this, I end my presentation and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nora. I think that was an excellent overview, gave us a little snapshot of how we are doing in terms of demography. We didn't get a lot of questions specifically on this topic yet, but it doesn't matter because I do have a few. I know that you've worked on editions of State of the Nordic Region before. So you also have a little bit of perspective when it comes to some of these trends. You mentioned that there were some striking elements this time, but if we just recap a little bit, what was for you the biggest maybe surprise in the process of what are maybe the things that we should all keep in mind going forward or stay on the lookout for in terms of future developments?
I think we can talk about two things here. On the one hand, I thought it was very surprising that we saw these declines in life expectancy that I have described now, because at least I wasn't aware before I looked into the data that this was happening. Then, of course, it could be a short-term trend. It could be a repercussion of the pandemic that we will not see anymore in 2 or 3 years. That might well be. So there are these short-term trends that I found were a bit surprising. Then, of course, we see that there are a lot of demographic challenges that we have in terms of population aging. We need to be better at integrating our immigrants, etc. There's a lot of these topics that we've dealt with for a long time. We see that will also be there in the future. And I think what we see now is that for some of them, there's a bit of an acceleration of the trend, one might perhaps say. We see that in terms of fertility. We've seen a decline for a longer time, but now it's been perhaps a little extra rapid after the pandemic. So some of these trends that we've seen will stay there, but perhaps they become even a bit more accentuated now. So building on our knowledge that we have, keeping up the discussion on how we can address them or adapt to them.
Keeping up the discussion, some trends are intensifying. I have a quick question to our participants as well. In terms of the trends that Nora just outlined and what we've seen so far, it would be great to hear how this is looking in your regions based on your experience or in your context. So if you have any examples to share, or if you have a top trend in terms of demographic developments that you think are having a big impact in your environment at the moment, please do share that in the chat. I think it would be interesting not only for us, but also for the other participants to hear how it is looking from your perspective. Another tip that I would like to share is that we, as Nora said, would like to continue the discussion, and we will do so for I saw that we had quite a few participants from Sweden in this session. If any of you are heading to Almedalen next week, to Almedalsveckan, we will be there with actually a couple of sessions. One of them will be focused on the fertility decline and the trend across the Nordics and in Sweden in particular. So on the 25th of June, you can definitely join us to continue the discussion and dive a little bit deeper into this topic. But as said, do share your comments in the chat. Maybe then my last question to you before we move on to the next part of the report. In terms of these trends, you said that we should keep an eye on these and take it into account in the future work. But as a researcher, where do you see maybe the gaps for the future, or how would you like to see some of this information being used in the policymaking or in regional development? Any
When it comes to how to use the state of the Nordic region, I think we have, a lot of policymakers, people who work in regions and municipalities here, and I think knowledge is always power. So this is the first step, I think, that we hope we offer a lot of information that you can use just to see where does my region, where does my municipality stand? How is the situation looking like at the moment? Then we also think it is always relevant and interesting to compare yourself with your neighbors, to compare yourself with other municipalities who are like yours in the Nordic context and see how is the situation there? Is there perhaps something that's different from what we are experiencing? Is there something that could perhaps be interesting to look at? How are they dealing with certain things? So we also hope that there the publication can be, so to say, a starting help. Then when it comes to research gap, of course, we still need to understand much better why certain trends are happening, like the decline in fertility in the last 15 years, for example. And this, as you say, we will also discuss, I think, quite in depth with a lot of experts at Almedalen. So there's for sure much more room to explore also going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Nora. I think that's enough of demography for now. We will share a link to the Almedalen sessions in the chat. You will get that there. We've also shared a link to the full report so you can go and dive in deeper. And I just want to remind you all, also those of you who might have been joining a little bit later, we are recording this session. You will have access to all of this material and, of course, all of the content of the report as well afterwards. Now I think it is time for us to move to the next section of the report, and that one looks at the labor market. We are going to explore that with Gustaf Norlén, who is one of our senior experts as well. He is also the editor of this report, and he, out of the speakers we have here today, has the most experience from also the previous editions of State of the Nordic Region. So he has a lot of perspective, a lot of insights in not only the latest situation of the labor market, but also the development of the Nordic labor markets over time. So, Gustaf, I will just hand over to you and let you tell us how the labor market has been developing, and we'll come back to you for questions afterwards. So put your questions in the chat after this presentation.
Thank you, Miia. Yesterday I was in Malmö, where we celebrated 70 years of the Nordic common labor market. And I haven't been around for that long, 70 years, but for some years, yes, as you mentioned. And let's see if we get the slides. There they are. So for this year's labor market section, we focus on these three themes, or these three questions. First, we wanted to look back to the pandemic and see how the labor market has developed. And spoiler alert, one thing that did happen was that the labor market was recovering stronger than we expected, maybe, at least me. And a lot of talk about labor shortage. So that's one that Eva Mersk has been writing about what are the reasons to this labor shortage. And then in the last chapter in this section, we try to look at the green transition and how it affects the labor market and with a focus on these geographical aspects of it. So that's basically what we have been looking at. And so the first question, how has the labor market developed since the pandemic? I don't know if you remember, I remember during this first months of the pandemic, unemployment was rising. We were all sitting at home, don't know what's going to happen. Is the labor market ever going to look the same? And ILO, the International Labour Organization, described the pandemic, the effects as deep, far-reaching and unprecedented, which of course was true in many ways. 70% of the world's population, or workers at least, they were in countries where with restrictions, or not even only restrictions, but that you couldn't actually go to work. Of course, a big effect on the labor market. So how did that evolve afterwards? Well, it was a very strong recovery called V-shaped by OECD, and which I think actually makes sense here. I don't know if you see that around 2020, there was a dip, but then it has been going up again. And they also compare this to the financial crisis that you can see a bit earlier there in the figure, that they call a L-shaped recovery with a dip and then a very, very slow recovery. So quite different trend there, and In fact, we have had now the highest employment rates in at least 20 years in most of the countries, except those that already have very high employment rates, like the Faroe Islands, Iceland, also Norway, I think, where they almost reached those levels. And this has been growing then for groups that have been far away from the labor market, like foreign-born, for example, outside of EU. That group have been, the employment rates have been growing quite a lot, especially, at least up till now. I don't know, in the end there of the curve, you might see a bit of a dip, and I will come back to that later, but at least in this first part of the recovery, it's been a very strong, hot labor market. And if you look at the map, which shows the same, the employment rate, so the share of people that are in employment in this age group 20 to 64, dark green, many people are unemployed, and the yellow ones fewer. And you can see some geographical differences, maybe mainly these between country differences with Finland, that has had a lower employment rate for quite a long time, but they have also been catching up quite fast. And I think if you compare this to the maps that we had in the previous editions, it's less differences between the countries. And it's not that big differences between urban and rural regions, for example. Rural regions on average have a bit higher employment rate, but it's not a very big difference. Yes, and another question, of course, connected to the labor market is remote work. It was one of the biggest effects, at least for us, and I think for many of you listening to this. Many of us did work from home and maybe have changed our working patterns. But we had two questions, of course, related to this. First one, is it here to stay? Will this trend of remote work continue? And then I think the one thing to remind ourselves that do work from home is that most people never work from home or cannot work from home. So it's more than 50% in all the Nordic countries that never work from home, which is a good reminder to us, I think. But yes, people do work from home, so around 40% around there in all of the countries, which is quite high. It's a quite big change to how it was before. And this you see here on the graph, also if they work sometimes from home or usually from home. And as you can see, then most countries, people work sometimes from home, meaning that we have a flexible relation to the work, but we still have a relation to our workplace. And here Finland stands out a bit, where more people working usually from home. And this relates to this second question that we have. Has this changed the movement patterns? Because then in theory, you can live further from your work. And now I'm stealing a bit from Nora's part here from the demography section, but there they looked at the internal net migration, so the moves within the countries, how that has changed during the pandemic. And before the pandemic, there was a clear urbanization trend. I now picture this with Finland. And we use this, our new Nordic urban-rural typology here, which is in 7 classes. So we can see the moves in these 7 classes that go from inner urban areas to sparsely populated area. And the inner urban areas are the ones in green. So the big bars that you see there in 2018-19. And you can also see then that so the movement went to the inner urban areas before the pandemic. During the pandemic in 2021, you could see decrease there in 2020 for these inner urban areas, but also even that people move out from the inner urban areas in 2021. So a clear contra trend there during 2020 and 21. But as you can see then in 2022, it's going back a bit. So are we back to the new normal? It's a question mark, I think. Let's wait for new data, as always. But yeah, during the pandemic, there was changes in the movement patterns. These maps also show the same thing. So it shows this internal net migration in 21 and 22. So 21 was the big year where people then moved out to the countryside. And what you can take with you from here, more areas that are blue means that they have a positive internal net migration. So people moving more moving in than moving out. And you can see a lot of blue areas in 2021, less so in 2022. And I think if you compare to the pre-pandemic, it will be even more red. So that was something about the development since the pandemic, but that also led us to this second question: what are the reasons behind the labor shortage? It became a hot topic for us. We got questions from many regions and municipalities talking about labor shortage, and they talk about labor shortages in all regions, in all sectors, and it was a very big topic. And we were asking ourselves then, why is that? Why now? Is it something short term or is it something long term? And of course, it's both short term and long term, I think. This figure shows the job vacancy ratio, so the proportion of unfilled vacancies that you can see now from 2010 to 2023. And also here you can see this V-shaped decrease during the pandemic, and then a very strong increase afterwards to record levels there in 2022. But here you can also see in 2023 the decline. So part of this, I think, can be explained by these short-term factors. And also looking back now to the previous state of Nordic regions, not only the ones that I've been part of, but I was been browsing the old ones. In one edition, they talk about high unemployment rates, and then in the next one, it can be labor shortage. So this seems to be a very cyclical matter. But of course, some part of these labor shortages are related to more long-term mega trends affecting the labor market. And ILO and OECD, they usually talk about these 4 mega trends affecting the labor market: the demographic change, climate change and green transition, technological change and globalization. And I will here talk a bit about 2 of them, the demographic change and the green transition. And of course, I think most of you know this demographic change trend that has been going on for a long time, of urbanization. But looking forward, so this map shows the projected development until 2040 for the working age population, so 20 to 64-year-olds. Red meaning decrease, and blue meaning increase, and this yellowish thing meaning a stable development. And what you first can say that even on a national level, in some countries, it's projected to be a decrease in the working age population. In Finland, Faroe Island, Denmark, and Greenland. And you can see that Finland is a forerunner here, that since 2013 there has been a decrease in the working age population. Of course, then meaning challenges to replace workers that are retiring. Less people are coming into the labor market than exiting it in many countries, but also especially many rural municipalities and labor markets. And connected to this, of course, the trend of an aging population, which also creates demands for especially in healthcare sector and health. So that's something about demographic change. There is more information in the report about other challenges of labor shortage that I don't have time to go into now. Instead, I will move to our last question here. How is the green transition impacting the labor market with this geographical focus? And in this literature of the green transition, it's you often divide the jobs into, some call it brown, green, white jobs. So brown jobs being the ones with the high emissions that needs to be they need to be structured to decrease the emissions, and then the green jobs being the jobs that are good for the environment and that facilitates this green transition, and then white jobs being these more neutral impact. And here this map shows the greenhouse gas emission per worker. So it's based on greenhouse gas emissions per sector, and then we have distributed that to the different municipalities, looking at this employment structure in each municipality and region. And something that was a bit surprising to me was that the greenhouse gas emission per worker was higher in the Nordic region than in the EU region, in the EU average, slightly higher. But also then maybe reflecting the different sectors that we have. And some of these high emitting sectors are transport, agriculture and food production, mining and manufacturing. And as you can see of these sectors, these are not sectors that you can get rid of. They have to reform how the sectors work, but you cannot just get rid of them. And if you look at on the regional level, the highest emissions per worker were in Åland. Mainly, I think 70% of the emissions was in the shipping industry. Also southern Denmark, Satakunta in Finland and Iceland. And on average, jobs in rural areas have higher emissions per person employed. That doesn't mean that rural areas are worse. These jobs are benefiting all the countries, of course, all the world in some cases, but it shows that maybe there is a higher pressure for structural change in rural areas. And then for green transition, we have used this method that OECD developed about looking at green task jobs. So it's based on the occupations of workers and how green they are according to the different tasks in these occupations. This is one way of looking at it, not the only one, I will say, but can be a good way of comparing. And according to this definition, around 3.4 of the Nordic jobs, around 25% are classified as green, which is higher than the EU average of, I think it was 17%. And here, also a bit surprising to me, but more green jobs are located in urban areas, on average around 28% compared to 1% in rural areas. And I think the explanation here is that in this early phase of the green transition, there's a high demand for new skills and innovation, and many of these jobs are located in urban areas. But of course, we know that the green transition and a lot of the investments that are being made in maybe not rural areas, but at least not in the capital areas. Like, for example, in the north of Sweden is the most famous example, I suppose. And the green job definitions, they look at the situation right now, or the year that you had the data, to 2021 in our case. But many of these investments are taking place right now, and of course, they depend on a high and reliable supply of CO2 neutral electricity. And here the Nordic region is standing out. I think Iceland and Norway has the highest electricity production per capita in the world. And also the other, and 96% of all the Nordic electricity comes from fossil-free sources already now, which is quite high if you compare that to the rest of Europe, for example. And this is, of course, a valuable asset. And this is what this map shows. It shows the electricity production by type of electricity production type. What do you say? And also the colors show the electricity production per capita. So these dark greens one are regions with a high share of electricity production by capita. But even though we have so much clean electricity or CO2 neutral electricity, it's projected that we need a big increase. In Sweden, for example, projections have shown that more than 40% more electricity is needed by 2030. So that's another aspect there of the green transition. And yeah, that was it.
Thank you, Gustaf. I think, again, a very interesting and a thorough overview of just how much is happening in the labor market at the moment. And what was also interesting is that we see a little bit of those links. Some of the trends that we saw in the demography world or sphere are also making waves in terms of the labor market development. I do have a couple of questions for you, and we will get to those in just a minute, but I actually have a question also to our audience. We've gone through two of the bigger sections of the report. We still have two parts left to go through, but based on what we've heard so far, I think it would be interesting for us to know how you see the possibilities to make use of this report in your own work. We have some ideas, and it would be interesting to see if you see potential for those, or maybe some other ways to make use of it. We see it as a food for thought, a conversation starter, a tool that you can use to compare your own region or municipality with your neighbors, like Nora mentioned earlier, do some of these cross-regional comparisons, maybe a little bit of benchmarking, and to use it for policy development and strategic planning and so on. But I would be keen to get your input on it. So we'll leave the poll running for a little while, and Gustaf, I will get to the questions that we got from our audience, because there are some interesting ones. One kind of, well, perhaps simple, perhaps not, but Espen is asking, what is the answer to the question? Is remote work here to stay?
What I now can speculate. That's nice. Yeah, I think it's here to stay in this hybrid form at least. But will it change movement patterns? That's too early to say, I think. Maybe there's potential, I think, but
so
I'm not sure.
To be continued.
Yeah,
Definitely
to be
something
continued.
we will keep an eye on in the future. All right, good. Another question from Anna. Is it possible that the steep decline of labor shortage from 22 to 23 is associated with rising inflation and business responses to the state of economy? We're going to get to economy quite soon, but from the labor market perspective, do you think there is a link?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a link there. Yeah.
All right, we have a few other questions here as well. Karen is sharing some insights from Greenland and their context. Very interesting. Have a look at that in the chat. But a question from Andrea here. Are there any observations about working age population which is out of workforce, other than those who are employed or unemployed? Is the share of the others increasing or decreasing due to COVID or other reasons?
Wait, the share of...
Share of others, neither employed nor unemployed.
Okay. Yeah, and that differs quite a bit between the countries, actually, how many are outside. Like in Sweden, I'm not going to go into the technicalities, but Sweden has high employment rate, but also high unemployment rate, because many are looking for jobs instead of being outside the labor market. And it looks a bit different in, for example, Norway, where they have very low unemployment rate, but sort of the same employment rate. So that's definitely a potential for finding workers, I guess, if you can make these people get out to the labor market, but also in a sustainable way, of course. I mean, many of them, they might be sick or for other reasons. So, yeah.
I'm going to take one more question from the chat, and then we will move on to the next part with the presentations on economy. But maybe more of a clarification or specification from Torge here. When you say fossil-free electricity, so regarding presentation,
Yes.
The assumption here is that you include nuclear.
Yes.
If nuclear was not included, how would the numbers look?
Oh, I don't have that in my head. But yeah, it's nuclear we have in Sweden and Finland. I have to come back to the exact number. I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. Torger, we have your contacts here. We will cross-check and we can follow up later regarding this. Also, if there are more questions to Gustaf, please put that in the chat. We'll pass it on. But now it is time to move on. As you see, the different topics have links and there are interconnections. The different factors and forces are playing together and having an overall impact. And that's what we're also going to have a look at now. We're going to move to economy, and we're going to talk about that with Karen Refsgaard, who is our research director of Nordregio, and she will tell you more about the Nordic economy. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Miia, and hello, dear audience. We're nice to see there's so many that wants to listen to the state of the Nordic region. I've been in charge of the economy chapters together with Jessen, together with Maria Brobinskaya and Camilla. That's Tova, which are our map cartographers, and also Carlos Tapia. So we're a big team, and that is, of course, the economy is complicated. The regional economy, as we have looked at this from three different perspectives, from the regional, from the business, and from the household perspectives, and we've been looking into both economic but also environmental and social indicators, which all matters for the state of the economy. While the Nordic region as such is doing very well, there are variations in economic indicators across countries and regions. On average, the Nordics have a 40% higher GDP than in the EU, 80,000 around US dollars compared to an EU average of 57,000. So we are a rich part of the European region. The growth was from 2021 to 2022, 3.5%, but it then, which was lower than earlier, and it even decreased until 23, until nearly only 1%. If we look at the map, which we are shown here, the European map, we see the regional GDP, the so-called gross regional product. And we can see that that varies between the Nordic regions from below 0 to above 10% growth. And we can see, for example, a very high regional growth in the capital region of Denmark, in Copenhagen, as well as some in the more northern and rural regions in Finland and Sweden. Looking more into the social indicators, household income is of course a very important economic indicator, revealing the social aspects through its distribution across municipalities and regions. And it is a common indicator of purchasing power for households. In the map to the left, the household incomes in 2022 are shown at municipal level, and the darker the red, the higher the income. One sees a large difference between the Nordic countries, regions and municipalities. Norway has the highest incomes, alongside with Denmark, while all the other countries have generally lower disposable income. Norway also stands out to having the smallest absolute differences between municipalities, and we can even see that in the coastal areas in the west, they are slightly higher than in the inland Norway. To the right, you see the change from 2018 to 2022, and blue indicates we have an increase in purchasing power, red a decrease. And there's a very clear picture here, with Iceland, Norway and Denmark have a steady increase, while all the other countries and in self-governing regions all have a decrease in purchasing power. The differences in income within the municipality we can illustrate through using Gini coefficients. The higher a Gini coefficient, the more unequal a society is. In the map to the left, we see Ginis at municipal level in 2022. We know that in general, the Ginis in the Nordic countries are low compared to, let's say, Anglo countries like the US and UK with a much higher Ginis. They are varying between 0.22 up to 0.28. But there are large differences between the Nordic municipalities. If we look at the map to the left again, southern Swedish and Greenland municipalities have Ginis about 0.28, very red, while Norwegian and Faroese municipalities are having the lowest Ginis, also with small difference between rural and urban areas. The map to the right shows, however, the changes, which are very interesting, from 2018 to 2022. Again, blue is indicating a decrease in Gini, that means a more equal society, while red is the opposite. And it's a complex picture. For most municipalities, we see that we have increasing inequalities and with large differences also between them. But they are, though, decreasing for the Faroes and for Greenland. It is, though, a challenge for the vision towards a socially sustainable Nordic region that we have increasing income differences both within and between regions. Yet another aspect of the regional economy is the gender diversity and equal pay. They are core social aspects, not least from a business perspective. The Nordic countries have long prided themselves as being leaders in gender equality, and we can see that in the graph you have on the picture. We see that numbers for gender wage gaps, just both for public and for private sector, All countries have since 2007 reduced the gender wage gap, but there is a very significant line for Iceland, which is gone from the highest to the smallest pay gap. This is a result of several factors: the Icelandic equal pay standard and other policies targeting the gap. And in 2018, for example, a policy enforced all larger companies above 25 employees to ensure equal wage for equal pay. So policies help. The business perspective is important. The SMEs are the backbones of the Nordic economy. They comprise about 90% of companies and over half of the people in work. In the picture, you see the SMEs and some numbers on innovation. And good framework conditions are important for the innovation of the SMEs for a competitive Nordic region. Traditional statistics often show that innovation mostly happens in urban areas, and in the map to the left, we see product innovation, a market introduction for a good or service. Oslo and southern Norway show high numbers, and Norway has a significant higher number of SMEs with product innovations than the other countries. But innovation is tricky to measure and monitor. So we have also looked into the process innovation. That means processes, marketing, and organizational innovation. And we see that gives us a bit of a different picture, and we see it takes place both in urban and rural areas, although the process innovation in the Nordics are lower than international numbers. A number of the regions with predominantly rural areas, often with smaller and medium-sized businesses, specialize in different types of innovative process innovation. Most Finnish regions, and for example also Region Mid in Denmark, which is a hub of SMEs, we see higher numbers than in the rest of the country. And in general, we would say robust regions are dependent on businesses and innovation, where both types are important for competitiveness and growth. The final indicators we're looking into are showing how is the environmental part of the economy. And we have looked at, basically, we've mainly looked at that through the emission of greenhouse gas emission, as also Gustaf showed it from the labor chapter, but from both a territorial and from a consumption perspective. In the diagram up to the left, you see annual changes in the territorial greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2021. In that picture, you see that Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, the three lower ones, have reduced since 2010, both due to EU policies, but also due to national level policies, which have contributed to these reductions. Norway, the dark blue, has experienced an increase from 1990 due to a recovery of the oil prices, which affected, of course, their oil activities. But from 2020, we see a slight decrease. Emissions have increased significantly in Iceland. This is the light blue at the top, which is mainly due to aluminium production, but also to a large tourism boom with more than 3 million tourists coming to Iceland every year, which of course impacts a lot on their use of energy. The territorial greenhouse gas emissions are closely linked to what we have of natural resource endowments, energy mixes, and production structure. Densely populated regions, earlier relying on fossil fuels for heat and power, let's say Denmark, southern Sweden, and southern Finland, we have seen decreased emissions in later years due to transition to more renewable energy and as a source for district heating, among others. The rural regions with extraction of resources, like we saw in Norway, but also in northern Sweden, where we have extensive industrial operations, are declining more slowly and still have challenges. Finally, in the green box, you see some few indicators on consumption emissions, which is, of course, when we factor in the trade in our territorial emissions, and that increases the Nordic greenhouse gas quite heavily. Although it is decreasing over time, the shares of the territorial to consumption-based are between, let's say, 50, 60 to 90%. That means that if we measure the consumption, we import a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in all the things goods we are importing. And in general, more than the import of goods and services of the goods that we use is over 50% are coming through import. Turning then to summarize what are the key takeaways for the Nordic region, I would say that we are rich countries. We have high incomes compared to the EU, 40% higher, but the GRP varies, and we have challenges because we have differences in the pay gap, a decreasing pay gap for the genders. We see increasing income differences between regions and between households. And along with that also comes an increasingly diversified population. These inequalities compose challenges for a socially sustainable Nordic region, which is important to consider. Second, the composition of businesses vary a lot across regions, from the northern Arctic to the southern agricultural dominated, from mining and forest in the east to the marine west. Their opportunities will rely on the resources and the competences they have. They do lack labor with the right skills in a lot of our rural areas. This is a challenge for a competitive Nordic region. Finally, a green Nordic region is closely linked to this green transition for both production and for consumption, and we have still decarbonization challenges. So it's important to consider the companies linked to the green transition that depend on access to predictable and fossil-free energy. And I would just end by saying that from the ministers' meeting yesterday in Karlstad, they mentioned that we should all be able to live, work and do businesses in every part of the Nordic region. And green transition is key in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Please stay here because we are going to have a couple of questions for you as well. One interesting comment just came through from Stefania, who questions a little bit the findings of the equal pay certification in Iceland and the results. So apparently there are some novel developments in Iceland as well, worthy of looking into. Thank you for sharing that tip. You already summarized, and I think that's also something that has been coming through quite a lot, the need to pay attention to the regional differences. The increasing income gap is definitely something that has also been noticed at the political level and is being addressed. But from your perspective, maybe also from Nordregio's perspective, thinking about the Nordic angle, where do you see the greatest potential for collaboration? What are the things that we can learn from each other, and where what type of experiences should we share, and what should we look at to address some of these issues that come up in the
the Icelandic case is of course a good one, an interesting one, but in general we have a same welfare model. We have a lot of experience in the collaboration between employers, employees, and the state, and I think there's a lot to learn from that. And we have just published a paper here on discontent, and I think it's very important that we work on these issues and still are able to learn from how we can collaborate and work and base our work on the trust. And of course there's a lot of good examples around in the Nordics on how businesses, how authorities, local authorities, and also local residents work together to create this green transition, creating trust at local level. So there's a lot to share between the Nordic countries on that.
Yeah, a lot to share, definitely, for sure. You also mentioned in the beginning that it's a very complicated topic to look at economy as a whole and all these different dimensions and all that. And from what we've seen, it's basically complicated with many of the other developments as well, because so many things are interlinked. We are going to look at how some of these different factors can be pulled together in just a minute, because we will also take a look at our regional potential index as the next presentation. But we had a poll running during the presentation and during the previous Q&A, because we were looking for some of your inputs on how to make use of the state of the Nordic region and how to make use of this type of comparisons and compilations of big amounts of data and information. And we have the results available for you there now, but I would just like to maybe get your comment on it as well. We see that it is a very even split. People plan to use it for cross-regional comparisons, for benchmarking, policy development, and strategic planning is at the top of the list. Over half of the participants think that it's a good use of this type of report. There are also some topics for new research, apparently. People are already seeing areas to pick up on, and also a tool for awareness raising, putting some of those important development trends on the agenda. But is there maybe something else that you would like to add? Or from your perspective, again, similar question to what we've discussed before, how would you like to see this report being used in the regions, in the municipalities, in the countries at the state level, or in policymaking, planning, maybe businesses as well?
I think it's always very, very good to compare oneself and take one step back and look at the country from outside. And that's what we can do when we meet from other countries and we read what they have done, because we can always get in these comparative views, whatever it's on data or on case studies, or because we have good discussions about the policies. I think there is a lot to learn from each other. And when one sees one's own country in comparison with us, one asks, why did they do better than us? And that's the first step to try to improve yourself.
So being open about it,
Yes,
looking at what is happening,
definitely.
not only in your own surroundings, but around, and taking some inspiration from there, being willing to learn as well, I suppose. Thank you for that. I think I see that the discussion on the Icelandic pay gap and issues is continuing in the chat. Great. Continue the discussion there.
We'll be happy to hear them.
Exactly. We will definitely take up the outcomes of that discussion as well for the future work. But now, as I said, we have one more aspect to go through, one additional, let's say, tool for you to make sense of all this data and developments and trends and such. We are going to look at what we call Regional Potential Index together with Carlos Tapia, another one of our senior research fellows, who will tell you what the index is and how you can make use of it. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Miia. It's a real pleasure being here today. And yes, I will be talking about the Regional Potential Index. This chapter that I have co-authored and co-drafted with my colleague Camilla Savatova, sorry for the pronunciation, and Gustaf Norlén, who is also here today. So the Regional Potential Index is a multi-item measurement scale, a composite indicator that incorporates information about the policy domains covered by this report, namely demography, labor markets, and economy. The RPI, the Regional Potential Index, is calculated for 66 administrative units in the Nordic region. The index is composed of 8 indicators covering the following aspects: degree of urbanization, gender, and age balances in the demography or population domains, employment, youth unemployment, and education attainment in the labor market domain, and regional production and research and development investments in the economy domain. The Regional Potential Index offers a comprehensive view of regional potentials, thereby making possible for policymakers and stakeholders to understand regional development in a holistic way. Moreover, the index tracks progress on regional development dynamics by considering the interactions between different policy dimensions, which is also critical to enable a proper understanding of development processes at the regional level. The Regional Potential Index has been included in the State of the Nordic Region report since 2016, with updates in the 2018 and 2020 releases. The RPA included in the State of the Nordic Region report 2024, the current release, has been calculated using a new methodology. This new methodology addresses some of the challenges on the previous version, and in particular mitigates double counting by assigning weights to the indicators based on their distinctive information they carry to the data model. So the more unique the information, the greater their influence on the total final Regional Potential Index score. The new methodology also mitigates compensatory issues by adopting a multiplicative aggregation function instead of the additive one that was used before. However, given that the Regional Potential Index combines information from various domains, it is advisable to use it alongside the various thematic analyses that focus on each domain individually, such as those presented on this report. For the sake of comparability, the Regional Potential Index was recalculated retrospectively with the new methodology for the period 2015 to 2023. The map on the screen shows the results for 2022, which is the most recent year with comprehensive data coverage. The resulting Regional Potential Index scores reflect the significance of agglomeration economies in the Nordic region. The best performing areas are the capital cities and other urban agglomerations in the different countries. Oslo reached the highest RPA score in 2022, followed by Stockholm County and the capital regions of Denmark and Iceland. In contrast, regions such as Greenland, the Eastern region in Iceland, and several regions in Eastern Finland scored lower on the RPA spectrum. These regions share several characteristics: sparse populations, rural economies, and in some cases also remoteness. The Regional Potential Index is a relative measure that fluctuates both temporally and spatially. In general, the evolution of the RPI scores shows that regional potentials are overall growing and converging over time. However, the changes in regional rankings of the different regions often provide more insights into the dynamics of regional potential or regional development processes than the absolute score variations on the index as such. Whether we consider RPI scores or rankings, it is crucial to remember that the variations are inversely related to the size of the regions. Generally speaking, smaller regions exhibited significantly higher variations than larger ones, and that's clearly something you can easily grasp by looking at the slide on the screen. Between 2019 and 2022, top performers were the southern region in Iceland, Kronenberg and Kalmar counties in Sweden, and South Karelia, Ostrobothnia and North Ostrobothnia regions in Finland. The labor markets and local economies in these regions demonstrated resilience in the face of external shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and the early consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Reversely, the northwestern region in Iceland, Faroe Islands, Åland, and Västmanland County in Sweden lost more than 10 positions in their RPA ranking during the 2019 to 2022 period. The decline in the northwestern region in Iceland was mostly due to a widening gender demographic gap. This trait can also be observed in Åland and the Swedish Västmanland County. The Åland archipelago and Västmanland in Sweden also experienced a slightly relative increase in unemployment rates, particularly among young people. In many of these areas, economic distress, motivated by the previously mentioned shocks alongside other stressors, translated into labor market challenges and occasionally also led to out-migration of younger individuals, in particular young women. So that was all on the Regional Potential Index. Thank you for your attention. I'm really happy to answer any potential question about the results or the methodology that we have used.
Thank you, Carlos. We do have questions. It's true that indices of any sort are bound to work in a certain context better than in others, and they have certain limitations, certain benefits. If we were to sum up a little bit, you said that it was introduced in 2016. It has changed a little bit over the years. Now we have an even more robust methodology behind it. What do you see as the best use or inspiration that people can draw from this latest version that we have?
Well, based on my own experience in building the index, what I would really encourage potential users of this tool, and the way I would challenge people to use the index would be essentially looking at what are the drivers, what are the motivations for getting those scores instead of others, and how their regions compare to others with similar characteristics. But in my opinion, it's more important to understand the process than the actual score or the ranking. So what is driving the index?
The drivers behind. So kind of an entry point to the rest of the report, even though it is the last part of the report, but it can be a good place to start. Excellent. You also mentioned that it's good to understand the process. I think it might also be good to understand the methodology, because if I look at the questions that are coming through, and we are getting quite a few, I have to say. Marcel is asking, how does the Regional Potential Index link to the European Commission's Regional Competitiveness Index?
Well, it shares some commonalities, mostly on the methodological process. So we are also trying to follow best practice recommendations by the ERC in terms of producing composite indicators. But the focus is different. Their perspective is more on innovation capacity. And our intention here is to use this index as a knowledge integration tool to bring together all the elements in the Nordic State of the Nordic Region reports. So in that sense, the goal is different, but the process to build the indicator is comparable.
Right. Espen is asking, how can one use the Regional Potential Index? This we already kind of covered, using it as an entry point, looking at the drivers behind, trying to understand how the different changes and trends and development interact and what kind of compiled impact they have, especially when it comes to potential and competitiveness and so on. But as always, I would assume the results or the outcomes of the index and the ranking also raises some questions. Andre here, for example, is asking or stating that he's a little bit surprised that the north of Norway is rather high on the list. And just a comment, maybe it's too general when Troms and Finnmark are measured together. Maybe should it be separate, or how carefully or how skeptically should one read the results?
Yeah, no, but that was a really good point. Actually, one of the things we are considering moving on or thinking about the future releases could be trying to be a bit more granular when building the index, and not looking into regional potentials only or necessarily, but trying to look into municipal or local potentials. So that is one of the things we are considering, because yes, the aggregation of different indicators at this course level is leading then to very, we are hiding away things or nuances that could be interesting to explore more in depth. So that's one of the deficiencies probably of this index.
There are also some other questions regarding, well, how to interpret the index. Julian, for example, is asking if the non-capital regions are catching up with the capitals, or is the gap increasing over time? Based on your experience, how does it look?
It's not only the capitals and the rest of the urban areas, but in general, what we see is that the trend is towards convergence in terms of potential. So most our data distributions show that over time, the differences are becoming smaller in general. However, this index, and this is one of the other limitations that I would like to mention, is clearly skewed towards agglomeration economies. So we see that the effect or the weight of big cities is comparatively greater than rural areas, and that we might be overlooking very important potentials in rural regions. So this is the other aspect where we want to put more attention in the following releases, trying to build it more robustly, not only in terms of how we aggregate the information methodologically, but also in terms of scales we just discussed, and also the domains that we are including, the indicators, the dimensions, to make it more balanced.
Yeah, so also an index that lives in time. But I also think it's very relevant to some of the other points that we've seen from the other chapters, the differences, the different, let's say, strengths and weaknesses in rural, urban, metropolitan, smaller cities, and so on. So it's no easy feat to put that together in one index. There are a few other comments, and I think we will take two of them and then start wrapping up, seeing that we're getting close to the end of the session. While we do that, I'm going to pick up the last comments from the chat. We have one more poll, one more question to our audience. Now that we've gone through the different sections of the report, we would just like to get some of your input and help for summarizing it. Which parts were most of interest to you? One, several, all? Give us a little bit of a taste of which chapters you might be looking more into once we finish this webinar. And then the remaining questions, as I promised. maybe a clarification. How come an Icelandic region is both a top climber and a biggest loser?
And this is excellent because the three comments were just spot on. So essentially what we can see, and as I already mentioned on this, one of the last slides, the smaller units clearly have a lot of diversity. So many of the regions in Iceland, some of the regions in Iceland only, or well, not only, but they have very limited number of inhabitants. Some of them 7,000 inhabitants. So then small changes on the indicators, like few people migrating in or out make a big difference. And those effects are those that you can see there. That's why some of these smaller regions have big fluctuations from year to year and big jumps in the rankings as well.
Yeah. So that, yes, it is interesting. And actually kind of related to that, there was just more of a comment from Laura, who pointed out that, for example, South Karelia in Finland has been on a positive track lately, but also with the very recent developments, 2022, geopolitical situation, all that, it has hit the region really hard. So it will be interesting to see how it moves in the future. So definitely, I mean, the index gives a snapshot of a situation at a specific point in time, and something to look out for in the future editions. Last question on this part from Harry. Can the comparison of regions be found in a table format? If somebody wants to look more into the results, is that possible?
Absolutely. We can share the table that with all the information that include or in which this analysis is based.
All right. That was a short, nice answer. Let's wrap up the regional potential index part here. I still have a couple of concluding messages, but this brings us almost to a close of our session. We had the poll running about the interests in different sections. You can still click your input if you want to. I will give you a couple more seconds, but I can already say that the results look very evenly balanced, which we are, of course, very, very glad to see. So in terms of which parts of the report are of interest to you, it's a very, very even split between the demography, between the labor market, the economy, and the index. And actually, majority of the participants in this session say that they are interested in all. So definitely, once we finish the session, pick up the whole report in the format of your preference and dive deeper into the results. I think we can close that poll, let you also have a quick look at the results, and then move over to a few concluding statements before wrapping up this session. I've just posted a link in the chat to all of the different versions of the report. You can find it there. We have it already available. You've received a link to it before the webinar. I will share one after the webinar with the recording. So all of this information is available there for you to make use of, and we really encourage you to take a closer look. I just want to share a couple of final highlights. So the report is online. We also have it in print. So if you are in events, if you see us some copy, but otherwise I encourage you to browse it online and dive deeper into it. We have also some interactive maps. You can look at the details of all of these different charts and figures and really focus on the aspects that you find the most interesting. If we move over to the next slide on the presentation, I just want to sum up quickly and say that we're going to look at different aspects, challenges, opportunities in terms of demography, labor market, economy, and the regional potential index. You'll find all of this and more in the report. So my final call to action to all of you is to go and have a look at the report. There is only so much that we can cover in a short webinar and an online session such as this, but I also want to highlight the high numbers and detailed comparisons that you can make. We have these maps available in the publication, but they will also be available for you to make use of as separate files. And as said, there are also some interactive versions where you can really zoom in to your own region or municipality and see how you compare to your neighbors and peers around you. So go and check it out. pick the format that matches your preferences, dive into the online version. It's perhaps, I would say, the most accessible out of all of those. If you want to have your own copy, you can download it as a PDF or, as said, get one of the printed ones. Before we wrap up, I just want to highlight that even though you've seen me and 4 of our experts who have been working on this report, there is a whole team behind this effort, and it has been a collaborative work, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of our GIS capacities, building the maps, the charts, the figures, and so on. So it really is a compiled effort that we are happy to provide for you as a resource, but we also hope that you make good use of it. So as we close, I would ask our speakers to join me up here. Thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you for being so active. Thank you for your comments, for your questions. You can still post more comments in the chat. Now, I would ask you to join us for a virtual round of applause, not just for the team who is present here today, but for the team who has been working on making this report a reality. The report is out. Go and make use of it. Thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you for being so active, and let's continue the discussion. Thanks a lot.